today at Mar-a-Lago. The president will be greeted by Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, his National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. They're there to talk about attacks launched yesterday by the United States on Iranian-backed militia in Iraq and in Syria. But they may also be talking about a memo that the Navy sent to the Office of Management and Budget. I'm joined by David Larter of Defense News, where he's one of the authors of The Drift, the must-read newsletter on naval warfare and the United States Navy. Good morning, David. Happy almost end of year to you.
Happy almost end of year to you. It's an unseasonably warm day here in the district.
It is indeed. We like that. Let me ask you, though, is it unseasonably warm at the Navy? It seems to me that if you ever wanted to step on it, this would be the time to step on it. Their memo to the OMB with the drastic cuts to the Navy is not consistent with the president's plan, and they have a navalist in Robert O'Brien over at the National Security Council, sees the president every day. What do you think is the response that they're going to get to this cut the Navy to the bare bones proposal?
I think the response is going to be negative. And in fact, the memo back from OMB was essentially directed them to provide a plan that's more resource informed, which is Pentagon code for find the money and put it towards getting to a 355 ship Navy, which of course has been the Navy's plan for years.
Now, they proposed instead going in the opposite direction from 293, correct, down to 287?
Yeah, 287. We're about 280, 293 now, and we're down to looking at 287 in the memo. And of course, going in that direction is absolutely counter to what the president said he wanted to do in his campaign. It's counter to what the Navy said needs to happen just to meet current demand. It's a very drastic change in strategy.
Now, they proposed decommissioning 4 littoral combat ships, cuts to the U.S. Navy destroyer construction program to retire 13 cruisers, and cut out an attack submarine and an FFGX, which is a guided missile ship. That's a lot of cuts. Was this a Richard Spencer innovation?
I don't know if it was a Richard Spencer innovation. I do know that the Office of Management and Budget wasn't impressed with it. And my sourcing tells me that it really did come from inside OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And they've been trying to find a way to pay for technologies like hypersonic missiles, technologies in unmanned, sort of these drones that can do warfighting tasks that they anticipate would be cheaper than large manned platforms. And to do that, they've consistently, the last couple years anyway, looked for places inside the Navy shipbuilding budget. And it's a fat target because it's a really big chunk of the budget and easily changed, too. It's easy to cancel a ship. But I don't know that it's going to be easy to cancel a ship in this political environment.
Well, not when the president's on record. And when I've just finished reading Robert Kaplan's Asia Cauldron. Before that, Michael Pillsbury, 100-Year Marathon. Before that, Graham Allison, Destined Before War. Before that, rereading Kissinger's On China. It's all about the South China Sea, and all the Army's divisions aren't going to do us a lick of good there. Special Forces, yes, but don't the cuts have to come from Big Army?
They could come from Big Army, yes. I think that we need to have, Hugh. I think the Army has a lot of CONUS, Continental United structure, and the question is, do they need all of that while we're just waiting for a big conflict? The Army's position would be, well, we cut our force last time, and then you decided you wanted to go on adventures in the Middle East, and we had to ramp up very quickly. And the ramp-up process got a bunch of soldiers into the pipeline that weren't all that impressive. But that's been the way since that's the way our founders envisioned it, Hugh. And I hate to sound so much like a partisan here because the Army has a point of view that's completely valid. But our founders crafted the Constitution to say that you raise an Army in time of war and you provide for a Navy.
The Navy stands. Now, let me ask you about Acting Secretary Modly. He's a big proponent of 355, but he's also an acting secretary. Does that make the Navy an easier target when they haven't got a confirmed secretary?
It does make the Navy an easier target. Having permanently installed leadership is a very important thing in the Pentagon. As when you're talking about when you're talking about a service that is going to be there a lot longer than any individual political appointee will be, they play games in this budget process. They'll delay, they'll push off decisions that they think maybe a new administration might take a different stance. And so these games get played all the time. And unless you have somebody that's there and that's confirmed and that's empowered, it's a lot easier for these kind of games to take place.
Now, David Laurita, one of the great books I received at Christmas from my friend Glenn Byers in Atlanta was The Fleet at Flood Tide, America at Total War in the Pacific, 1944 to 1945, by James Hornfisher. I don't know if you ever read it, but the size of the Navy when war beckons is enormous. Part of that is sea lift. You wrote about sea lift today. Not very sexy, absolutely essential.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's an underappreciated part of our sea power as a nation is the sea lift fleet. And it's old, Hugh. I mean, some of these ships are edging on 50 years old. And there's, to the point we were talking about earlier with the Army, I mean, if you've got all these Army divisions and heavy equipment in the continental United States, but you can't get it to China or you can't get it to Russia, what is the point of having it in the first place?
Now, I'm skeptical of fears that because Esper is an Army guy and Secretary Pompeo is a West Point guy, that they both favor the Army over the Navy. I know O'Brien's a navalist. I don't know who's driving this in OSD. Is this a bureaucratic move, or is it a politically directed blowback? Is Esper trying to stand in the president's way?
I don't think that would be a fair characterization because I just don't have enough information directly on Esper, and I also don't think it's fair. I mean, I think it is fair to assume that if you come from the Army and that's the fighting and the fighting style and the war fighting that you know, it's fair to assume that you could have existing biases towards that to that service, but that doesn't mean that it's malicious. And that doesn't mean that they're executing some rogue political agenda. I think that we have, as big a budget as we have for the military, and it's, creeping in on $750 billion every year. A lot of that is eaten up by things like personnel, and you have, the pay and benefits that you give our men and women in uniform, and a lot of it's taken up by just, having the fuel to keep these ships underway. So the money that you have to invest in new things comes a lot of times from either existing force structure. You could shuffle money between departments by cutting some soldiers out of the Army and moving that money towards buying new stuff. But it is a tough balance.
Now,
that they have to
however, somebody makes that choice. Somebody writes that memo to OMB. It's not a bureaucrat. It's not turned out by a computer. Somebody says, cut 4 LCS. We're not going to build a new attack submarine. Somebody makes those decisions. Does the president have in front of him the names of the people who made the decisions to screw over his plan? I know Modley's in the room saying, I'll get you to 355. I can get you there in 10 years. I have sources who tell me that. Does he have where the opposition is? I think it's important to know clearly who's standing in his way.
Sure, and I think that probably means I have to do more reporting because I don't know exactly who's standing in his way, except that these kind of budget games happen all the time. And yes, this is sort of the nature of the Washington beast, and I think it's one of the things that is very hard to explain to the American public when they hear one thing from their political leaders, and then you have a different message coming out in leaks to the press. And
so, Dave, you talk to everybody. You really do. That's why I've got you on. When you say to them, the president talked 355 on 3 occasions. He talked a 12-carrier fleet deployable on 2 different occasions, both before and after, during the campaign, after he was sworn in. Are you comfortable just disregarding that? Do you ever ask that question to career uniform and civil service?
I think we've been pushing very hard on a plan for 355 ships. I think, Congressional Research Service and other sort of organizations that do this for a living, that follow this, have been pushing.
Yeah, but do people talk to you honestly about, we don't care what the president says? Do they honestly?
I don't think anybody has ever told me that inside the military.
But it's implicit, isn't it?
What's that?
It's implicit. When they produce plans that aren't even remotely close to achieving the president's stated goals, it's implicit that they're overriding the president.
I think that's a fair criticism. I think it's fair to say that the plan that was produced and sent to OMB was directly stands in contrast with the plan that the president laid out on multiple occasions. No question.
So if it defense one, your editor said, David, I need in the budget for January 8 pieces on Navy acquisition, and you produced instead 8 pieces on Army acquisition. What would happen to David Larder?
I don't think my editor would be pleased.
You'd be fired. Am I not right?
I think that's probably fair, yes.
So does anyone ever get fired for defying political leadership? I really do think this is what, by the way, Boris Johnson is saying and Dominic Cummings is saying. Dominic Cummings wants to cut the defense budget in Great Britain a lot because he thinks their carrier is silly. And that's an interesting story for you. But he's being very blunt about having to change the civil service. Do you hear any of that coming out of the Trump White House?
I've heard, obviously the same things that everyone else has from the president about the career politicians in Washington, D.C. sort of undermining the political leadership and the desire for the people that they are obviously, that when they elect a president, they elect an agenda. So obviously I've heard the same things from them as you. But I haven't, again, I'm not sure that it's necessarily fair to anyone who's trying to execute this sort of national defense strategy to say that they're somehow directly trying to defy the president. They are faced with a lot of difficult decisions.
You're much more generous than I am, David. The one thing I know that he said, he didn't say an X number of divisions. He said Space Force and a 355-ship Navy. They fought him on Space Force, the civilian bureaucracy. They're fighting him guerrilla style on the 355-ship Navy, and I think Modley and others just have to stand up and pound the table, and I hope Secretary Esper does as well, and I hope they have that conversation at Mar-a-Lago. David Larder, follow him on Twitter at David_Larder. Follow Defense News at Defense_News. Both are important sources for everything related to the nation's defense. Thank you, David.